So welcome. My name is Jerry White. I know quite a few of you here tonight. I'm the public officer for Circular Economy Huon. I particularly want to welcome our representatives, our government representatives, the elected representatives, Jackie Patrusma, Dean Winter, Rosalie, is she here yet? Peter George, and there were acceptances from one or two others, and we'll look forward to seeing them. Also, the candidates for the coming Huon Upper House election, and Deputy Mayor for Kingborough, Claire Glade-Wright is, thank you, Claire. Paul Gibson, I found out in the Mercury at the weekend, well done, Paul. Michael Rowan, another independent. So thank you and welcome, and welcome to the Mayor, Sally Doyle, and CEO Lockie Cranz. Thank you very much for coming along. I've had a number of apologies, but I won't go through them all. There's one that we feel is particularly important, and that's a lady called Liz Smith, and she's invariably at these occasions as the convener of Circular Economy Huon. She's over on the Big Island meeting with family and friends. So she is an apology, and there are others, of course. Let's start by doing an acknowledgement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Moluccany people of the South East Nation and the Palawa people of Tasmania, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I want to mention Circular Economy Huon and why we're here this evening and what we're trying to do. Have we got a slide that says what we're about? It helps to know what our aims are and therefore what we're doing here this evening. Thank you. Our aim is to promote sustainability, resource efficiency and community resilience in the face of climate change and resource depletion. That's a general statement, of course, and over the last 7 or 8 years that we've been in existence, we've been looking at a number of subject areas, which has included the general area of waste, of housing, we've looked at education. We're at the moment building a sustainable guide for consumers in the Huon Valley, and probably the major effort that we've had is looking at transport. So transport fits within that, and transport does really fit into our aims because of emissions and the waste that we see. So this evening is about reducing the waste, making things more efficient within the transport zone. So that's the purpose of our meeting this evening. We've got some short presentations, relatively short. It's an opportunity to hear from you guys what you think needs to happen as well. So it's a two-part process. And we will go through the schedule for the evening, and there will be plenty of time for comment, brief comment. If you've got a lot to say, that's fine. Put it in writing and send it to us. But we've got to give equality of opportunity this evening for everyone to participate. In terms of housekeeping, I've turned my phone off. If you could reduce the volume on your phone in case you get interruptions, that would be appreciated. There are teas and coffees next door, so feel free to wander through and help yourself. The other part which is important is that toilets, the ladies is through the opening across there, and the gents is up the stairs. If there's an emergency, I guess we go outside. There's doors there and doors there. I think that should be reasonably straightforward. We're a community group and we're self-funding. This evening we'd hoped that we had one of those square things that we could grab your money for those of you that wanted to make a small donation. But apparently it's going to take 4 weeks for that to be functional. So, you know, $50 bills when you're walking out, if you want to, just leave it on the table. Laurie is our treasurer. Laurie, do you want to stand up? He will take the money. He's an honest man. Thank you. A number of people to thank for this evening. I want to thank Council for the use of the hall and for their support in putting this on. I want to thank the speakers, which I'll introduce shortly. I also want to thank, is it George? It was going to be Kathy for the speaker system. Huon Production Services, you might want to write that down for the next function that you run. Thanks very much indeed, most appreciated. And also to Mike Gissing, who is behind the cameras and filming the evening so that we can put it on our website. Thanks very much, Mike. The thrust of the evening will be to look at what the needs are in terms of people and transport in the Huon and in regional areas elsewhere in Tasmania. So we're going to start this evening with Esther Schilling. Esther is the Diversity and Inclusion Officer in the Connected Communities at Huon Valley Council. That means she works for Huon Valley Council. Esther has been at Council for 3 years at the Youth and Community Development Officer role, which involved supporting youth programs and advocating for young people in the Huon Valley. The Diversity and Inclusion role expands her scope to include Aboriginal communities, LGBTIQI+, migrant communities and people living with disabilities. Esther is passionate about social justice and inclusion, having completed a Master of Social Work in 2022. Esther moved to Tasmania from a place called Sydney 13 years ago. Only thing she misses about Sydney is the trains. I don't know whether this is a pitch or not. Thanks very much, Esther.
Fabulous. I'm so glad I'm going first to get it out of the way. So today I'll be sharing some data that was collected as part of Council's Community View Survey around April-May last year. The aim of this survey was to understand what's important to our community and to guide Council's work. So I've got a QR code up there, but I'm going to navigate away from that slide. But that just shows the website there. So next slide, please. In the survey, respondents were asked to choose 5 of 16 livability factors that are most important for them that make the Huon Valley a good place to live. So the left column shows the community's rankings of these factors. Respondents were all asked to rate their experiences of these factors. So the right column shows everybody's experiences. Obviously, these livability factors are all interconnected. We know that affordable, decent housing is often further away from services, but I'm just going to focus on 2 factors today, which are most directly related to transport. So reliable and efficient public transport, which is the shorthand there is public transport, and making your way to and from services such as employment, education and healthcare with relative ease. And the shorthand there is making your way. So public transport, as you can see, there is the 6th most important factor to the community. So that means over 30% of people in our community included it in their top 5 most important things. However, it's the second last for their experience, with an average of 4.1 out of 10. 21% of people had making their way in their top 5, but the experience there is higher at 5.8 out of 10. So some people would have selected both these items and some only one. I drilled down into the data to look at various groups to see if their experiences varied from the average. So there were 66 respondents between the ages of 16 and 25. For them, the importance of public transport didn't vary, but 32% rated making their way as an important attribute, so higher than over 10% higher than average. Similarly, 91 respondents who identified as First Nations, the importance of public transport didn't vary for them either, but making their way was also more important at 26%. 19 people under the age of 25 identified as First Nations, and their ratings were considerably higher. So 37% of them rated reliable public transport as one of their top 5 attributes, and 42% rated making their way as important. So the other part of the survey that would be of interest is one open question where people were able to respond to what could be done to improve the quality of life for people in your local area. So people were free to write whatever they liked in there. So an overwhelming theme across the open comments was need for much better public transport. Over 130 people specifically mentioned public transport, and that they'd like to see improvements to the system in the area. So that was over 10% of the survey responses. People repeatedly called for more frequent services, extended hours and weekend options, cheaper fares. Some noted that would mean they wouldn't have to rely on cars to get to work. Several commenters asked for school bus linkages to main bus stops, which is something young people have raised in conversations with me, that buses don't seem to be well coordinated. For example, they'll catch a bus from somewhere like Glen Huon or Judbury to Huonville, and they'll have a half an hour wait in between the connecting bus to college. Unfortunately, I realised the survey didn't ask a question which would allow us to filter responses for people with disabilities, so I wasn't able to look into that. But I've definitely had conversations with community, and accessibility of public transport is a big concern. And so very briefly, I did want to touch on services that are available. So we have Area Connect, which is a part of CTST. Saw someone here. So which helps connect people to jobs and training where there's limited transport available. And there's also 2 local driver mentoring programs that support people to get their driving hours. So there's Gearing Up, which is based out of Kingston Neighbourhood House, and Jumpstart, which is based out of Jeeveston Community Centre. And that's all I have to share. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. It really is interesting to hear about the data that has been collected and the need for transport in different areas. When I think back over a number of years, there have been a series of questions about what people want, and so often transport comes up. And quite often we talk about public transport when we mean transport, because it's a generalised term. I'm now going to become somebody else because Deb Mill is from the Tasman, and she's been doing a lot of work on transport. And to save her coming here, we've got a series of slides talking about the work that they've been doing. Deb is a community engagement worker in the Tasman, and they've done a lot of work in terms of survey of transport needs. There we are. So the report is a very comprehensive report, and it would take a long time to go through that. The reason we're referring to it today is that we see that people in regional areas across Tasmania are experiencing similar things to the Huon. We're particularly focused on the Huon, but we think it's important to look at what's happening elsewhere within Tasmania. Thanks. The next slide. Transport is not just about buses. It affects daily life, employment, health, community participation. So they did an investigation in terms of where transport was needed and where it was wanted. It was not a small sample. They were able to get 10% of the adult population of the Tasman. It's not a big number, but it's significant, I think, in terms of trying to get facts and figures on transport needs. The issue is widespread, and it's also a structural issue. Thanks. Next slide. They delved into what sections of the community required different things, and they found that there was a whole selection of different people with different transport needs and solutions. Some needed predictable weekly trips, so the request was for one trip a week from one location to another and back. And for other people, it was far more flexible that their requirement for the future. Some of the services exist. There are some gaps. But there's also that communication factor. How do you find out about what's available? And when I think about travelling on the bus as a regular bus traveller from Huon Valley into Kingston and Hobart, you see first-time people that are nervous about going on a bus. And so there's a lot of information that we need to put out. Next slide, please. So the key message is flexibility. They collected a lot of data about when and where and why people wanted to travel. The transport needs are layered, and it depends upon where people are in the community and their needs. And a blended model provides predictability and responsiveness. Thank you. One of the interesting things that Deb came across and referred to in her report was that there is a rural transport service delivery framework. Is anybody aware of that? It's basically a framework for regional areas of Australia, and a way of looking at transport and how well the regions are being provided with transport. And I think that's quite significant. It was produced in 2018 and has been applied in some areas, and it's something that we should be more aware of. It's about coordination, clarity, and sustainable delivery. And as it says, the solution must be fit for rural reality. And as we know, that can be a variety of things. Last slide. Thank you. If you want the full report, Deb is more than happy to supply it. So I can give you the details, or you can take a snapshot of that. But there's a lot of information, and I think it sort of builds on the sort of conversation that Esther's had, which gives us a good idea of deficits and needs. Thanks very much. The next person who's going to speak is called Austin, and Austin's not here. I mean, somebody with a transport name like Austin you'd think should be here. So I'm going to refer you to the sheet, one of the sheets you've got on your chair. Austin has done a lot of work on the regional context within the Huon, and he's talked about the way that we operate now, the reliance that we have on private cars. Has everybody got a sheet? There's a couple at the front here. On the chair there, that's right. Good one. Everybody else has got a sheet in front of them? Good. The various points that he makes are quite straightforward. That rural residents travel further than urban residents. Does that sound reasonable to you? Good. There are limited transport alternatives outside private vehicles. And I'm aware that as we're talking about that, we've got Lyndon Stevenson from CTST, and that's a service, and also Shane Dewsbury from TassieLink here this evening, and it's great that you can make it, but we realise that there's only a certain amount that you guys can do, and our reliance on the private car is fairly heavy. We have an ageing population, which increases transport vulnerability, and the other figure that comes out, we were talking about emissions and the importance for Circular Economy Huon of reducing emissions. And apparently the figure is 50% of emissions in the Huon Valley are from transport. You're happy with that figure, Malcolm? Okay. So you would prefer to see 40? Good. Okay. In terms of the private vehicles, there's some interesting figures here because it has an estimated value of the fleet of private vehicles of 200 million. The average running cost per vehicle, 5,000 to 6,000 a year. Sound reasonable? It probably depends on the car and the vintage and how you paid for it and whether it's an ICE vehicle or an EV vehicle. Estimated total annual running cost, 30 to 35 million. It's an indication of what we're already spending on transport as private citizens. And it's suggested it's a proportion of 16% of the household income. And then something else that Austin was keen to know is that if we did transition to EVs, what would we have to spend to get there? As a lower population, as a lower income, a poorer region of Tasmania, Tasmania being a poorer region of Australia. So it gives us an idea of the sort of money that's being spent and where we can look at transport for the future. Significant private capital tied up in transport. The costs are borne largely by households. Are you happy with that idea? It's households that are basically paying for transport. And he puts a statement at the end there that systems are largely uncoordinated. That could be debated, and maybe our transport providers will debate that later. And then there's a suggestion about the sort of things that we can do. Improve transparency, strengthen links, and so on. And I think we'll come on to that shortly. It's looking at where we need to go in the future. So these are some of the problems. It gives a profile of the Huon Valley and the costs. Now we want to change tack somewhat, and I want to welcome Mary Haviland. It always amazes me the expertise that exists in the Huon Valley. And Mary is an example of that. Mary's given me a brief bio in terms of her experience, having worked as a transport professional, and you're running an agency in Sydney?
It's a national one.
It's a national one. Having worked internationally around the world, 10 years overseas?
Yep, so I lived on the beach in the Philippines, worked on an oil rig in Indonesia. I hung out in the UK for about 9 years, and then lived in Italy for a year as well.
So
Work in the Middle East.
yeah, a bit of experience in transport. Yeah, great. So welcome and thanks very much.
No worries.
We'll hand over.
Okay. Now I've got a booming voice, so this microphone might be a bit much. What Jerry didn't mention is that I am a recovering traffic engineer. So I take it one step at a time. I've been practicing for about 30 years now, and I practice as a transport planner. But sometimes I have to be careful of not just slipping back into my ways. Because when I started out in my career, life was really simple. In fact, doing a transport plan was a pretty awesome way to make money. What we used to do is we used to look at how are people travelling now. And we used to look, in fact, we didn't look at how people travelled, we looked at how vehicles travelled because we could count those. And if you could count it, it mattered. So we looked at how vehicles travelled. We looked at them, how they travelled in the peak hour. It was too hard to get data for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we tended just to look at the weekday peak hour. And we took the number of vehicles travelling and we looked at the growth rate of an area and we extrapolated it out to whatever future date we were given. We'd then do a bit of a gap analysis and we'd look at how the road's going now, how would the roads go with that amount of people travelling around in the future, and then I'd give my client a shopping list and tell them which roads to go out and build, which traffic signals to change and how to sort out that congestion. Job done, all was good. The only problem was all we had planned for was for people travelling to work by car in the peak hour. We hadn't accounted for 90% of those other journeys that were happening during the day. We didn't count how my mum got to the doctor, we didn't count how my kids got to school, and we didn't count how we walked to the shops. So this version was called Predict and Provide. If we go to the next slide. We predicted what was going to happen and we told the client go forth and provide it. Now, about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, someone came up with a great new slogan called Vision and Validate. And what they were saying is, what if we could predetermine our future? What if we, as a community, could say, this is my vision for how I want to live. This is how I want to get around in the area where I live. This is how I want my kids to have travel choices and travel options. I want to set a vision for my community. And this is something actually the Huon Valley Council just quietly is quite good at. And they've busily been going around doing all those soft and waffly workshops, asking people, how do you want to live? What do you value? What's important to you? And what they're busily doing is setting up visions for the future. What they now need to do is set up some plans of how they're going to deliver on that vision. And we're going to have to validate those plans. We're going to have to give them some of the evidence that Esther has to start with, and we're going to have to count more than the cars that are travelling to work in the peak hour. Luckily, everyone is now carrying around these. And these are fabulous because even when you're not on an app, even when you haven't consented to giving data, you're setting out little beeps. And all those little beeps are being collected by mobile phone towers, and we casually buy all that data and we can pick up lots of mobility information that we didn't used to be able to have. So my life has become a lot more complicated because I now have clients like Lockie who's going to say, Mary, I want you to produce a transport plan that's going to consider everyone in the valley, not just those people driving to work in the peak hour. And I want you to count all those journeys, not just the long distance journeys we used to be able to count. I want you to tell me, how are people going to walk? How are people going to cycle? How are people going to use active travel, public travel, transport? So you've made my life really hard. Now, if we move to the next slide, we've already talked about how diverse the valley is and how many people we're catering for and why this is so important. The other thing we need to talk about, though, is the next slide, which is recognising that our transport network, which down here is our roads and streets, actually have two functions. They're not just supporting a transport network, they also make up our public spaces, and they can make up 80% of the public space in any of our little towns. And the problem with that is that they're a very competing need when it comes to designing solutions. Because as a movement corridor, people want to move as quickly and efficiently as possible through an area. When we're trying to design for place, we want it to be sticky. We want people to stop, stay, spend and meet and do all those great things. So they can be really competing objectives. And whereas my life used to be really easy when I took something like the Channel Highway, for example, super easy. It was a primary arterial, end-to-end, better look at how fast people can travel through there, better look to see if there's been some accidents, better have a look at how the freight's going on it. Now, I'm going to have to look at it a bit differently. I'm going to have to look at the journeys not just through, but what about the journeys of people who are accessing Cygnet? What about the people who are walking and using that corridor to make local movements as well? Because the Channel Highway is a movement corridor when I'm in Craddock, but then when it becomes Mary Street, and that's usually a bit of a clue, they change the name, it actually becomes a main street and it has all these other functions. And then actually on a Sunday it changes again, it's a bit of a chameleon, it becomes a market and it becomes really important. It's got lots of local movement and lots of activity and people crossing the road and things, and it becomes a civic space. And every time it changes street environment, we have to change our solutions. We have to change how we design, how we operate, what speed people are going at, and we have to be far more responsive in what we're doing. If we jump to the next slide. One of the things with having vision and validate is previously with predict and provide, I could take existing data and extrapolate it out and give you some solutions. And we were only looking at the solutions that worked for now. And we said we'll use the same solutions in 20 or 30 years' time. If we're talking about a vision for 20 or 30 years' time, we know that how we move around is going to change. We're going to have autonomous vehicles. We've already got autonomous vehicles. We've got connected vehicles. We've got electric vehicles. We've got micro-mobility. We've got digital services. In fact, we might not even be moving as much. So we've got a whole range of different solutions. No client ever wants to be the first one to invest in something. They want a bit of evidence. They want to know, is this going to work, and is this going to work in my area? So it becomes really important to have case studies and to have libraries and to have networks and to be talking to people, not just in Australia, not just in Tasmania or Australia, but globally, what is working elsewhere. This is an absolutely fabulous program by the EU called SmarterNet, and it was set up to look at regional and rural transport solutions, and it collected 20, 30, 40 case studies across Europe and collates them all together on the one website, where you can see all the solutions that have been implemented in different places and also some of the outcomes of those solutions. It's also a bit honest. It does tell you how much things cost. It tells you what worked and what didn't work as well. The program came to an end in 2024, but they're keeping all the case studies up until 2027. So it's a great resource to look at. And we're having a bit of a peruse through here to see, well, what might work down the Huon? And so we're looking up in the first left there. That's actually Portugal, and quite frankly, I just fancy going to Portugal. But it's also a region which had 6 big towns. They were about 15, 20,000 population, so big towns by our scale. But then it also had a range of villages around it, and they were more 1,500, 2,000, and that really resonated with me. And what was interesting was these are all demand-responsive transport solutions. So that's instead of having a big bus that runs at a certain timetable on a set network, the same every day, it's having generally smaller vehicles that are going to work in demand as they're needed. And so this one in Portugal, I found interesting, was because it mixed the two. It had, between the big towns, a set network that went around, but then it had feeding out into the villages the smaller on-demand services. And it's also really interesting to look at how the different people and the different from the different demographics used it. There tended to be younger people in the bigger towns, and they were quite happy to use an app, but some of the older communities, they were much preferred to either telephone or just make their booking when they see their driver for next week. So there were definitely differences between ages and how people want to access transport. The next one is from the Netherlands. And that one was really interesting because it's about 20,000 people, so not far off the population of the Huon Valley, and it's an island. It's about 40 kilometres away from Amsterdam. It's got a little ferry service, and it's really popular in the summer. It's got beaches. It had a beautiful translation that I think was done by AI because it talked about the beauticious environment that it was in. What's really interesting with that example was the way in which they coordinated the services using a digital app. So it combines the ferries and the regular services, and then it also had the taxi company was brought in, and they were a really important stakeholder in the conversation, and then the on-demand services that were added on top. Because what's really important is to make sure that you're not cannibalising the existing public transport that you've already got. The app on it was fantastic, and they actually had like an 86% usage of that app. And where that's interesting is that Australia is very similar to the Netherlands in that we both love digital products. We all love a shiny new toy, and we're really early adopters of digital solutions. So the Netherlands is often a really good place to look at for some of the technology solutions they have. Other options I've seen is some of the new developments they've got and some of the new precincts they've got, where they're not having private car ownership in those precincts, but in return they have a significant investment in public transport, all supported by digital apps, etc. The other one down here is also from the Netherlands, and it's about the language and the mobility hubs that they have. So a mobility hub is moving on from your bus stop. It's so much more than a bus stop. It's on steroids. It's more than a train station. So what your mobility hub will have is your regular service feeding into it. It could be a train station, probably not in Tassie. You'll be waiting a while. You'll be waiting a while for a light rail too. But anyway, you could be a bus stop with a rapid bus service coming to it, and then it will have other mobility solutions there. So you'll be able to not just park your bike, but you might have some electric bike hire. You might have a go-get car. You might have a car share that is running from there. And it's not just, you will have good walking and cycling links, you'll have real-time information telling you, unlike my son at the bus stop this morning who I had to quickly dash up to Huonville because the bus came at a different time. I'm sure it wasn't Tassie Link. But giving you that real-time information as well. The other cool stuff it has, though, is it has your parcel lockers there as well. So it means that I can pick up my Australia Post deliveries, and you can even get the local supermarket to deliver. So the big mobility hubs, big service, but you can also scale it down so that the little services become a little bit like the one behind the Signet Town Hall, where you can have your electric car charger, you've got your bus stop, you've got the bones there sitting there waiting for it. It just needs some real-time information and a bit of better bicycle links, and you've got a small mobility hub happening. And then finally, there was one from Slovenia, and the reason I was interested in this one was it was a community transport system very similar to what we had here. And it was focused, this one was focused on older residents and the aged and providing them with community transport almost identical to what we have. Once again, a lot of it was done by telephone and booking ahead. And the issues with having to use the telephone and a computer system for booking compared to an app is you often have to do it 3 days in advance or a week in advance. You can't just do it, 6 hours in advance. Which, considering I can do a delivery that's going to come from Woolworth this afternoon, and I can organise a delivery driver to bring me goods, it's kind of crazy that my mum still has to wait 3 days for community transport to take her somewhere. But what was interesting with this one is with case studies, it's not just the good and all the success stories, but it's also sharing some of that shared pain as well. And so this one was talking about some of the issues they have with volunteers that great, low cost for starters, great for community, but it does mean that they're challenged at holiday periods, they're challenged on the weekends to get volunteers to provide these services. And sometimes it's just nice from a case study to see some shared pain. So if we jump to the next slide. Now, surprisingly, the UK is no longer part of the EU SmarterNet program, and they have some separate programs and they have separate data collection. This one was a program of 17 different demand-responsive transport solutions across the UK. And once again, they collected the data and looked at the end of the programs of what worked and what didn't work. And one of the really hard things was looking at the cost of it all. So it was finding that for similar demand services that had been running in various communities across the UK, it was on average costing about £23 per trip. So that's about $46. And in return, they were getting about £2 back. So it was preparing you for a little bit of pain to run some of these demand services in regional areas. But one of the things that was interesting was to look at, well, how do we count benefits? That's the cost, but how do we count the benefits of these systems? Traditionally, when we look at transport benefits, we look at travel time and travel time savings, and that's the really important metric. However, the UK is making quite a significant shift towards accessibility. And so they've updated a lot of the values in their Treasury Green Book, and they're putting accessibility values. So when we look at a program like this, we need to start looking at, well, how many people now can access a health service? How many people could access an education opportunity? How many people could access an employment opportunity? So we start to count the benefits as being around accessibility as opposed to just a travel time saving, and looking at that in our transport. If we just jump to the next slide. Finally, autonomous vehicles is the other thing we love to talk about at transport conferences. They're going to be amazing, particularly in regional areas. I'm no longer going to need that flock of volunteers because I'm going to have these little cars that will take my mum to the doctor. It's going to be awesome. However, we need to look at it also with a regional lens on as well, and some of the challenges that are likely to be there. At the moment, we're mainly seeing autonomous vehicles used in urban areas and in the cities. So you will have seen the Waymo taxis going around San Francisco and New York and coming to Australia this year. One of the reasons they stick to the cities is not just because they like the nightlife, but also they quite like the roads as well. Regional roads are really challenging for autonomous vehicles. They don't work well in the fog. They don't work well in heavy weather conditions. And so until we can have some improvements in technology, they are going to be challenging to run in the regions. And then similarly to demand responsive transport, one of the things we have to look at is we end up with fairly small fleets, which is great operationally to run them, but it can be a challenge when we've got a one-off event. So if we've got a fire, if we've got a flood and we need to get a lot of people out, we don't necessarily have the capacity to do that. Or if we've got a big event happening at Macquarie Point or something and we all want to go to the footy, it's going to be hard to do it in our little autonomous vehicles or community transport. So finally, one of the things that all of these examples, whether it be in the UK or Europe, had was that it was connecting you to a bigger network. It was connecting you to a regional network. A lot of the time they had trains or they had rapid buses that were happening. So then if we go to the next slide, we start to look at, well, what about the Huon? What's our regional network? What are we hooking into? What are our longer distance opportunities? So on top of the bus services that we've got coming down here at the moment, we've got some of the longest bus routes of any capital city in Australia. Getting the bus from Dover to Hobart is an hour and 40 minutes. So they're very long services, which means that they're only running 2, 3, 4 times a day. It also means that when we get to introducing electric buses, we're going to have some challenges about how we're charging those buses and the depots that we're going to use. It also means that, is it serving our communities for community trips and for those smaller trips? Because at the moment I've got 3 buses a day going from Cygnet, but that means my teenage kids can't get to Huonville to have a part-time job. It means my mum can't get up to Huonville to go to Service Tasmania. If I had 6 services a day, 8 services a day that just ran between Cygnet and Huonville, it would be more effective than the very long services we've got now. And then the other one to look at is how we get further afield within Tasmania itself. And the regional coach services we have in Tasmania have degraded over the last 20 years. If you're getting a bus from Hobart to Launceston, it ain't going to be from Central Station, it isn't from Flinders Street Station. You get a bus stop outside a shop front on the back of Liverpool Street, and that's what the front door that we present to our tourists, our visitors and anyone else who's wanting to travel intrastate in Tasmania, and with the coach services we have. And if we just jump to the next slide, there is good stuff happening. There's a big investment announcement, well, not investment announcements, there was a big announcement made last week for a strategic business case for a rapid bus network in Hobart. So this is potentially a spine for us in the Huon to connect into, potentially. It's an $820 million package over 10 years. That sounds like a lot of money. Actually, in transport terms, it's not. It's going to cost $90 billion to do a fast train between Newcastle and Sydney. It will cost $160 billion to do suburban rail loop. It cost us $30 billion just to do WestConnex. So we're not talking big biscuits here at all. But of that, the state government only has 20% of the funding for it over the next 10 years. And the news for the Huon is that the Southern Corridor is at the end of the program. So you're going to be waiting at that bus stop for a while for the rapid bus service. However, if you go to the next slide, there's plenty we can do in between. I've already spoken about how we can look at the existing bus networks we've got. We can create a great spine down to Huonville with very frequent services connecting up to that beautiful rapid bus network that's going to happen up in Kingston or Hobart. We could re-look at the services, and I know there is a network review that's out at the moment, but we can connect this village centres better. We can connect Geeveston down to Dover better. We can connect Cygnet better. We can connect better out to Glen Huon and Judbury and have more regular services running into Huonville. We could put some of those mobility hubs in the meantime. We can create, instead of a stop behind Skinner's Drive, we have an opportunity there to create some real-time information, comfortable shelters, to put some bike racks in, to put some bike share system in. We might even get some of those fancy lockers from Woolies going. We have the opportunity to create the little mobility hubs out in the community as well, to also give people a sense of identification and connection with transport as well. And then we have the opportunity to pull together all the great community transport services we already have. We have school transport, we have community transport, we have some on-demand services. We even have an Uber running around occasionally. But what we can't find is any information for that. So in the meantime, we can just put the information together onto a web page on the Huon Valley site. We could then start to connect the ticketing information. We can start to connect the service running information. Eventually, we could get to booking information, and we can create a digital solution. So, as usual, I've talked far too long, and I could talk forever. There is plenty that we can do, but transport is so important. It's a lifeblood to the regional community, and we need to look at it as a service that's giving us access to livability. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. Some interesting ideas. What I find fascinating is that the Smarter initiative in Europe was about recognising that the regions needed a transport system that was not identical to city centre transport systems. And then they set about saying, what have we got operating at the moment, bringing those ideas together and producing that report. I find that fascinating. One of the things that Mary mentioned was the capacity for active transport. Ellen, do you want to stand up, please, and tell us, just very briefly, you're the focal point for the working group.
Yes, we just want to start a little working group to discuss active transport solutions in Huon Valley. So that's things like cycling, pedestrian access, new pathways, all those sorts of things. It's part of the public transport conversation, but it's slightly separate. So we've got a little sign-up sheet at the table if it's something that you're interested in and want to sign up and help us, collate information and people's experiences, hopefully talk to some of our representatives and get a few more options for active transport in Huon Valley.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Ellen. We've done our talking for the evening, for the most part. Now we're interested in hearing from you. I was going to say the elected representatives first and the candidates. There are probably a couple of questions here. One is there anything that's particularly struck you this evening as being significant in terms of transport, either looking at it for the regions or the Huon Valley? And the other thing is, how could you make it happen? Who wants to go first? I think we've got a microphone here.
Look, I think it's a transitional issue, largely. We're spending a lot of money on the current transport system, and if all of that money could be, spent on an alternative transport system, then we would actually have a bells and whistles proper transport system. But my question is, how do you get from something that is sort of staggering along and working now to the new system? And I think that the main thing at this stage is to do lots of strategic planning so that all of those corridors, the walkways, the cycle tracks, everything that leads into the future transport system are in place at the point when that actually comes to fruition.
Thank you, Paul. Claire, for next.
Is it working? Yeah. I don't know who I'm asking this to, but I was wondering if there has been any kind of future thinking around park and rides that could service a ferry. I know up in Kingborough there's lots of talk about the ferries there going from Kingston Beach and Blackmans Bay, but unfortunately there's no space to have the car parking there. So I'm just wondering if down this way, if there's been any sort of forward thinking about park and rides that could service a ferry. I note that a ferry service is a wonderful option because you obviously don't have to maintain a road. You've got a passageway there that doesn't require lots of maintenance. So I think ferries are a really good option, but yeah, I'm just wondering about the forward thinking for the park and ride facilities that would connect those ferries.
Does anybody have an answer to that? We'll take that as a question. Malcolm, could you jot these points down? You're doing it already. He's on the board, Malcolm. Was there other elected reps that want to make a statement?
There was a ferry that operated from Port Huon. There was a ferry operated from Port Huon to Cygnet that no longer operates. And I think the geography of the ground here in the Huon wouldn't support a ferry service.
Michael Rowan, Jerry, if I can jump in. Here we are. Before we talked about the circular economy quite so much, thanks to Ellen MacArthur, we used to always say reduce, reuse, recycle. So a question I would have, and I'm no expert in this at all, is how much of the transport needs in the Huon Valley is desired rather than required? So are there services in the Huon Valley that aren't in the Huon Valley, that if they were provided here, then much of the need for transport, which is not chosen by the person, would be obviated. We wouldn't need to travel. And so I guess the point that I'm making is when we're thinking about transport, the first thing to ask is, why do we need to travel? And how can we avoid that need? Thank you.
I feel there's a long answer to that, but we probably haven't got time for it this evening. I guess services increased to a certain extent. Was there anybody else who wanted to make a comment? Peter?
Oh, yes. What is it about politicians? They're always demanding to speak. Look, I thought what Margaret's presentation was great. It was a real eye-opener, and it's nice to know that you can look around the world and see examples of how other countries and how other societies are dealing with regional rural transport. One of the things that I noticed, though, and it's a problem that I consistently, I deal with. I live somewhat south of Cygnet on the Channel Highway. The Channel Highway from, say, Woodbridge southwards down on the channel itself, then all up towards Cygnet, is very sparsely populated particularly by European terms, very sparsely populated. And there are a lot of areas in the Huon Valley that are very sparsely populated. So when you showed us the sort of transport hubs, and when we saw the diagrams of where major services would go, what you see is major regional centres being approached and then a blank canvas. And I don't know how you deal with that, but I think that's always going to be a real problem in the Huon Valley. And if you have answers to it, which I suspect you have, you didn't talk long enough. Thank you.
Mary?
Well, there's a couple of things there. First of all is to recognise we're actually really fortunate compared to suburbia. Most of our town centres were designed well before the car. and they're really walkable, they're really accessible by options other than vehicles. But as you rightly point out, when you get outside of Cygnet, when you get outside of Geeston, it is very sparsely populated, and it is hard to get to the bus stop. It is hard to get to that pick-up, drop-off point for on-demand transport. One of the things, particularly amongst younger people, we're seeing is micro-mobility is huge, and we're seeing a very big uptake in the Huon Valley as well. Where people aren't using it to get to a hub is they don't feel safe to leave their vehicle at the end of that trip. So, you know, my kid's worked really hard all summer in the cherry sheds getting his electric scooter. He doesn't want it nicked at the bus stop when he goes off to school. So it's providing the facilities there for them to safely leave those connecting options. Similarly with mobility scooters as well. You have some centres, I know where I used to live in England, where you used to be able to get off the bus in Macclesfield and then you could pick up a mobility scooter to get around town as well, and they were part of one of the community services they offered. But similarly, do we have parking at our hubs for our mobility scooters as well, where they can similarly leave things safely? So there's a few solutions around. Some of it's technical, technology, and then other of it's community as well.
Thank you. And while the microphone is here, Dean?
I wasn't going to, but maybe spoke, so yeah, look, a really interesting discussion at sort of listening to Jerry speak about transport makes me realise that I've been in Parliament for a bit over 4 years now, and we had very much the same conversation when I started, and not much, unfortunately, has changed. And the presentation from Council was really interesting because it pointed that there's this a real need and want for better public transport solutions, but actually it's one of the areas that people are being most let down by. So there's this dichotomy in there. I can't help but point out that the biggest infrastructure project in a transport sense being delivered in south of Hobart is the 5th lane on the Southern Outlet, which is the dumbest, stupidest project that must ever have been put. And what else could we do with that sort of money? The other thing I wanted to say is, I guess, coming back to the Huon Valley and listening to issues, it's health and transport are two of the biggest ones. And I wonder if policymakers like myself and other state parliamentarians are thinking about these issues. We think about the transport portfolio and we talk about issues all over the state, when in fact maybe we should be thinking about it from a different point of view. So should there be a Huon Valley policy or a south of Hobart policy? We've got 10% of Tasmanians live south of Hobart, between Kingborough and the Huon Valley. And the biggest issues that come up are health and transport. Of course, there's others as well. But actually, should we be thinking about regions and what regional Tasmania needs? And down here, things like health and transport are really important issues that I don't think we've got the right answers to the questions that people are asking. So for me, I think it's integrated services that respond to needs of people, whether you're in Dover or Huonville or over in Cygnet or wherever it is. We're not getting it right at the moment, and this is an important part of getting that answer correct, but working with the great start of what the council's done, and then adding things like the Huon corridor study, the Channel corridor study, which are a good start, but let's integrate all of that into something that's focused on what people down here actually need.
Thank you. From one Dean to another Dean.
No, I find it really interesting, and I think I catch up with Lockie down at Council quite regularly, and I find it interesting that the work that they are putting into it, because it's about, from Council's point of view, collecting data and understanding the needs of their community, and it is spread out. And so, being rural, we certainly have different aspects, and Mary touched on some of those. So it's about that, I suppose, outside of the box thinking and future-proofing things. And I think our council down here are doing some really positive work with particularly the Huon, the Main Street master plan that they're putting together. So it's understanding all that work. And I think the transport hubs that were spoken about are a very interesting concept for somewhere down here.
Jackie.
Thanks, Jerry. And look, I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight and just sharing your points of view. Mary, I'd want to really thank you for your presentation tonight. You've certainly given us a lot of information and a lot to think about and unpack. And it's so I, for one, would really appreciate a copy of your presentation. And it's I think it's just about and just sort of like what the Circular Economy Huon, your aim is to have, more efficient and sustainable services. So I think what can provide the most efficient and sustainable services down here for the Huon Valley, but what can be the small, sort of the quick wins that are realistically achievable, because, and that's what I sort of like when Mary was talking about, those sort of focused on, smaller mobility hubs. What things can we achieve, whether it's Australia Post putting in the lockers that, are behind the council in a better position, or, food, what can we get to start on this road forward that is realistic in quick wins before AVs dramatically get a lot better than what they are, so that they can get around. Because I think AVs, and that's why I was really appreciating your presentation, everyone thinks AVs could be the answer, but as you were saying, they might work very well down here. So what can be put in place to lead on this journey towards more efficient and sustainable services?
Thank you. Thank you. And you mentioned council. Sally, Lockie, comments, suggestions, commitments?
I don't make commitments without consulting my councillors, so...
There are several here tonight.
Not enough, not a quorum. Look, lots of questions. Thank you to everyone that's that presented, as well as the hearing some of the thoughts from various elected persons. I think that, look, a lot of what was said tonight is, well, clearly, we looked at evidence that council's collected. We need to act in an evidence-based way to provide for our community. There's a lot of demand for a lot of different services going in all different directions, and ultimately, despite you can make a great benefits case on many things, at the end of the day you're still having to pay for it in money terms. Either that's through direct user pays or the government raising revenue in order to do that. So there's just that obvious tension. I'd encourage people to have a look, and it's actually going to our first structure plan for Huonville, which has been a significant piece of work, and what Dean Harris was just alluding to. There's a significant program of strategic planning work that is council's most significant contribution to planning for transport. In that first paper, there's one coming hot on its heels for Signet, but the Huonville one talks heavily around transport and is exactly the kind of vehicle that we're setting ourselves up to provide better multimodal connectivity, walking, cycling, end-of-trip facilities, all of these things, better parking, just a better experience. There hasn't been the investments in these things, and there haven't been the strategic plans that acknowledge our changing demographics, acknowledge our growth that's happening down here. So for us, that is the centre point for what we can do ourselves in terms of delivery, but also setting ourselves up for that advocacy. We aren't a transport provider ourselves, but if we're going to, our key role is advocating on behalf of our community. So it's important for us to know what the actual specific needs are and make sure that we're asking for something that's realistic and achievable, and increment towards that. So some of the solutions that Mary put up, sync very much to council's thinking. It's just making it happen and having the evidence base for it.
Thank you. That's really encouraging to hear, that the sorts of things that Mary's talking about and things that are happening elsewhere, there's strategic planning taking place to move that here. I'm wondering whether either the transport operators, Shane, do you have some thoughts on what you've heard this evening? Suggestions?
Yeah, hi. So for those who don't know, my name's Shane. And my wife own Taslink Transit. We've been running buses down here since 1998. So we've seen a lot of change over those years. And one of the challenges we have with our decision makers and the people that promote transport is how they see it and understand how it operates. So we have our urban operators, which is owned by the government, which is Metro. Then you'll find most regional services are provided by private family-run operators. So that in itself causes confusion on what service levels we get, and we are we're contracted by the government to provide services into the regional areas. We run services across Tasmania, and I'd like to say that the Huon Valley is one of the best models and rewarding corridors that we have. And I want to tell you why. Because when we first started running services in the Huon Valley, it had 6 services a day. Now we've got 20. We had old buses. Now we've got the most modern buses in the world on the Huon Valley services. They're designed for the Huon Valley terrain, so they've got bins. So if people have bikes, we can put bikes underneath them. We have designed a low-floor, high-entry bus that has seatbelts, coach seats, because we realise the distance that people travel and on the roads that we travel. The Huon Valley was one of the first corridors to go on the green card to connect to Metro. No other operator's done that. But if you ask people that around the communities, can you catch a Taslink bus and a Metro bus? You'd be surprised at how many people don't know that. The Huon Valley was one of the first corridors to get real time. We're the only bus operator that introduced real time 4 years ago. With the real time, the Huon Valley, the Huonville, is the only town in Tasmania that has a real time bus timetable display. That's when I can keep it going from the damage that gets done to it. That was done with a trial with NEC, one of the first in Australia. The responses from other things that we do, we need to look at and use to move forward. So we talk about technology, we talk about modern vehicles, we talk about information through technology. What was the repercussions or what was the outcome of the express services that we put in from Huonville to Hobart? That is a product that's gone crazy. Some of the services have trouble with capacity. It's only been running for 4 or 5 years, but it must be a product that people want to go from Huonville to Hobart direct. So we need to build on that. The other thing that we probably need to think about is the success of the half-price fares. Now, I hear our leaders talk about it didn't work in the urban, but the urban pays $3.60. What do we pay down here in Huonville? Exactly right. So we've seen different things being put into place that's increased our patronage numbers. Over a year now, we're probably transporting around about 250,000 trips a year. So to me, that is again something to build on. We talk about our hubs. How can we improve it? How do we make people feel safe? You know, we talk about what happens in Skinners. Is it the right thing to help encourage passengers to jump on our bus? Would I want my kids standing in Skinners Lane at 9 o'clock at night to catch the bus? So those are the triggers that we probably should build on if we want to create a better passenger transport system.
Can I add one last point that I think you've missed, which is really, really important, which is bus drivers. And TassieLink has some of the happiest bus drivers I hear, but they've got some of the highest retention rates of drivers, and that is so important. Anyone who's tried to get a Metro bus up in the city where your service hasn't turned up again can attest to that, and I think it's something else that we're very lucky with down here.
I think
not
that's
lucky,
a really
we're fortunate to have.
We try to employ like Anthea, who's been around the Huon Valley for years and years and years. And by employing locals, they understand locals.
Yeah.
And one thing to remember, during COVID, the local drivers around here turned up every single day.
Shane, thanks very much. We're running short on time, as these events often are. Lyndon, is there something that you want to add to the discussion? 2 minutes.
I'll be really quick. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks for the putting on the forum. Very important. So my name's Lyndon Stevenson. I'm the CEO of CTS Community Transport Services TAS. I'm also a local resident. So a little bit about Community Transport Services TAS. We're a community organisation providing essentially 3 transport products. One being community transport, so supporting older people or younger people that have a condition that prevents them from undertaking normal daily activities. We have drivers, about 120 vehicles across the state. We have drivers, volunteers, we have some paid staff as well. In the community transport space, we have small little routed services. We actually partner with our good friend Shane here in Queenstown as well, and some of the other areas we do some public transport, small buses, thin markets. And we have another service called Area Connect Jobs and Training Service, and that's a new service that we developed as an organisation in response to some of the challenges where consumers or passengers weren't eligible for community transport. Was able to put a service together to help people. I mean, in the Huon Valley, we're delivering around 1,000 trips a month through jobs, transport, training, jobs and training transport, as well as community transport. I think the presentations were great. The obvious challenges are, the regional and the small thin markets, or the small groupings of community, the distance. I do wonder though, is there an opportunity to look at what services and what capability there is in the Huon, and look at, and I say that because some of our services we deliver have very finite eligibility. And are there ways to actually look at those types of services somewhat differently? But look, in the spirit of 2 minutes, I'll leave it at that. Oh no, I won't go there. We've got some hours. So I won't go there. I don't. In fairness, that's a bigger conversation. That's a bit of a bigger conversation. But ultimately, if you keep it simple and think about what are the assets or the infrastructure that is available, and how can that be leveraged to support more people. But it does mean you need to think very carefully around agreements, funding agreements, and how it fits into government policy, etc. So much bigger conversation.
Thank you, Lyndon. We said that we would run from 6 o'clock till 7:30, and so we're coming towards the magic hour, although we started late. What we being Circular Economy Huon want to pull out of this evening is a list or a reference group of people that are interested in transport in the Huon, to add weight, to push for change, for looking at some of the initiatives that Mary was talking about and how we could get those underway here. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, there's a form on your chair, or under your chair, or around your chair. We would love to hear from you, and if you could fill it out now. If you haven't got a pen, I think we've got extra pens at the back. Can we bring them forward, please? So that you can stay in touch with us, and we can stay in touch with you. Who needs a pen? So the idea is that we'll call this a reference group. So this is a larger group of people that are interested in transport and improvements. And from this, we'll try and form a working group that works with transport and state government and our representatives to bring this together so that we lead to change in the future. So that's the main purpose of collecting your information this evening. But it will mean that then we've got a road. Is that the right word for transport? A road for the future. I try. Yes. So if you could complete those, and can we have those collected? Do we need to do that while people are seated?
No, I think people can leave it at the front.
You're prepared to trust them? Yes. They've got to go out the back door? I mean, they've got to go through the door there? Yes, yes. So I would like to thank everybody for coming this evening. There are many of you that we didn't hear from. This is not to curtail the conversation. If you want to contact us and tell us your thoughts on transport, that would be fantastic. We've already had 2 reports that have been handed to us. I haven't gone through them tonight, but for the working group that we're hoping to form, this will be useful information. And I'm sure that many of you have got information that will help us to build the picture so that we develop something out of this evening. So thanks very much again for coming. We appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thank you.